Mark glanced at the clock on the living room wall. 11:30 p.m. Another late night for Emily. This was the third time this week she'd come home past midnight. She had mentioned a new work friend, keeping her tied up with endless projects, but something about her demeanor was off. He had noticed it weeks ago, her distant gaze during dinner, the way she checked her phone obsessively and quickly silenced it whenever he walked into the room. Their marriage hadn't always been like this. When they'd first married, they were inseparable. Emily was bright, driven, and affectionate. Over the years, her ambition led her to climb the ranks at her job in corporate finance. It made him proud to see her succeed, but now success had come with a price. Lately, she seemed like a different person. Her smiles were hollow, her laughter absent. She no longer touched his arm when passing by or kissed him goodbye before leaving for work. Mark missed those moments more than he cared to admit. He told himself it was just a phase. People drift sometimes, his friend Ryan had said after a poker night a few weeks ago. You've got to give it time. She's probably stressed. But Mark wasn't so sure. Tonight something felt different. The air around him seemed heavier, as though filled with invisible pressure. He sat down on the couch and picked up his phone. After a moment of hesitation, he opened the location sharing app on his screen. He hated snooping like this, but something inside him urged him on. Emily's location appeared within seconds, a small pin glowing on the map. His eyebrows furrowed. She wasn't at work. In fact, she was nowhere near it. The map showed her deep in an industrial district on the other side of town. Mark's heart sank. That area was notorious for crime, gang activity, illegal dealings, and worse. Why would Emily be there of all places? Maybe it's nothing, he muttered under his breath, trying to steady his nerves. Still, he couldn't shake the unease clawing at him. The more he thought about it, the more the images in his head spiraled out of control. 10 minutes later, he was in his car, steering through the darkened streets with his jaw clenched. The closer he got, the fewer streetlights there were. Shadowy figures loitered on corners, watching cars like his with suspicion. Mark tightened his grip on the wheel as he spotted Emily's car parked near a rundown warehouse. His stomach churned. Mark parked far enough away to stay hidden but close enough to keep an eye on the building. He slouched in his seat and waited, eyes scanning the scene. A few moments later, he saw her. Emily stepped out of her car, dressed in business casual clothes, but with an alert, almost paranoid look about her. She glanced up and down the street before approaching the warehouse door. Two men, both tall and rough-looking, appeared from the shadows. One of them nodded in her direction, but Mark couldn't hear what was being said. The other man threw a glance over his shoulder, catching sight of Mark's car. The man's eyes narrowed suspiciously before he turned and followed Emily inside. Mark's mind raced. What was she doing here? Was she in danger? He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, fear, anger, and betrayal all crashing over him at once. He debated rushing after her, but something about the men's demeanor made him pause. They looked dangerous, like men who wouldn't hesitate to escalate a situation if provoked. Instead, he waited, his pulse pounding in his ears. Time crawled by, each passing minute stretching longer than the last. He leaned forward, squinting at the warehouse entrance, hoping she would emerge soon. But she didn't. An hour passed. Mark felt his paranoia building. Was she in trouble? Or was this something else? The thought he had been avoiding finally hit him like a punch to the gut. What if Emily was having an affair? He tried to push it away, but the signs he'd ignored for weeks now screamed for his attention. The secret phone calls, the late nights, the cryptic excuses, it all pointed to the possibility he dreaded most. Eventually, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He started the engine and drove home in a fog. By the time he pulled into the driveway, exhaustion had replaced his earlier adrenaline. Yet he knew sleep would be impossible. Emily returned around 2 a.m., slipping through the door like a ghost. Mark was waiting for her in the kitchen, his arms crossed. She froze for a second, surprised to see him awake, but quickly recovered with a smile. "You're up late," she said casually, heading toward the fridge. I could say the same about you, Mark replied, his voice strained. Where were you, Em? She sighed and gave him an amused look. Mark, you don't have to interrogate me every time I work late. I told you, business stuff. In an abandoned warehouse? He shot back, narrowing his eyes. Emily paused for half a second, then burst out laughing. Is that what this is about? Oh my God, you're paranoid. It's not what you think. I had to meet some contacts there because their office is under renovation. Mark stared at her, searching her face for any sign of the truth. She played it off so convincingly that for a moment, he doubted himself. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But as she kissed him lightly on the cheek and went upstairs to bed, Mark's gut told him otherwise. He knew when Emily was lying. And tonight she had lied through her teeth. The next morning, Mark barely slept. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Emily peacefully asleep beside him. Her steady breathing, once comforting, now seemed eerie. What else was she hiding? His mind circled back to the previous night, replaying her calm dismissal and the menacing figures that had followed her inside the warehouse. By dawn, Mark was downstairs, nursing a coffee and scrolling through his phone. He searched for any information on the address where he had found her. Most results led to vague mentions of security companies and import businesses, nothing concrete. One article, buried deep in the search results, mentioned a police raid from years ago. Drugs and illegal weapons had been found in that same district. The information didn't help. If anything, it made him feel worse. Emily strolled into the kitchen, yawning and stretching. Morning, she mumbled, moving toward the coffee machine. Morning, Mark replied, keeping his voice neutral. He studied her as she poured her coffee, calm, composed, the perfect picture of normalcy. I have to head to the office early today, she said, sipping her drink. Big meeting with the regional directors. Mark nodded slowly. You seem awfully busy these days. She gave him a small, tight smile. Yeah. It's just that time of year. Mark swallowed his frustration. She was too smooth, too practiced. He wanted to demand the truth, to shake her until she stopped pretending everything was fine. Instead, he bit his tongue. Pushing too hard would only drive her to be more secretive. He needed to approach this carefully. After she left, Mark called in sick at work. He had no intention of spending the day at his office when so many questions gnawed at him. Instead, he drove to the address from last night, parking a few blocks away to avoid attention. The warehouse was quiet, seemingly abandoned again in the harsh light of day. Mark sat in his car, debating his next move. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Was he invading Emily's privacy? Was he making himself crazy over nothing? But something told him that waiting for answers wouldn't work. Gathering his courage, Mark stepped out of the car and approached the building. The rusted metal door was slightly ajar. He hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching, then slipped inside. The interior was dim and cavernous, with stacks of crates lining the walls. Dust and the faint scent of engine oil filled the air. He took a few cautious steps forward, listening for any signs of life. In the distance, he heard voices, low, indistinct murmurs. He crept closer, careful not to make a sound. The voices grew clearer. A man's deep baritone echoed through the space, followed by a woman's response. Mark's pulse quickened when he recognized Emily's voice. He crouched behind a stack of crates, peeking around the corner to get a better view. Emily stood near a cluster of men, all of them dressed in nondescript clothing. They seemed to be discussing something serious, though Mark couldn't make out the details. One of the men handed her a folder, and she flipped through its contents with a practiced air. It was a side of her Mark had never seen, calm, confident, and authoritative. What the hell was going on? As Mark leaned forward for a better look, his foot brushed against a loose piece of metal, sending it clattering to the floor. The noise echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. Did you hear that? One of the men said, his head snapping in Mark's direction. Panic surged through Mark. He ducked behind the crates, heart hammering in his chest. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Who's there? The man called out. Mark held his breath, every instinct screaming at him to stay still. The footsteps stopped a few feet from his hiding spot. He could see the man's shadow stretching across the floor. After a tense moment, the man muttered something under his breath and walked away. Mark waited until he was sure the coast was clear before retreating the way he came. Once outside, he hurried back to his car, his thoughts racing. Whatever Emily was involved in, it was dangerous. The men in that warehouse didn't look like corporate clients. They looked like people who dealt in violence and secrets. On the drive home, Mark's mind whirled with possibilities. Was Emily in trouble? Was she being forced into something illegal? Or was she willingly part of it? He didn't know what to believe anymore. When Emily returned that evening, Mark was ready to confront her again. He kept his tone casual, probing for information as they sat down for dinner. "How was work today?" he asked, watching her closely. "Busy," she replied with a sigh. "Meetings all day. You know how it is." He smiled tightly. "Must have been exhausting." "Yeah, but it's worth it," she said, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting away. There was a flicker of something there, anxiety, maybe guilt, but she covered it quickly with a cheerful smile. Mark decided to push a little further. "You ever work with clients outside the office? You know, in unusual locations?" Emily's fork paused midair. She gave him a puzzled look. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "Just curious." She laughed, a little too forcefully. "No, of course not. Why would I do that?" The lie was blatant. Mark nodded slowly, playing along. "Just wondering." As they finished dinner, Mark's resolve hardened. He couldn't trust anything Emily said anymore. Whatever she was hiding, he would find out. He had to. Mark woke early the next day with a plan forming in his mind. Emily's lies gnawed at him like a slow poison. He couldn't afford to confront her head-on again without solid proof. If he pushed too hard without evidence, she'd just dig her heels deeper into deception. He poured himself a cup of coffee and scrolled through his phone, looking up private investigators in the area. The idea felt extreme, but he couldn't shake the image of those men from the warehouse. Their presence and Emily's odd behavior didn't add up to any innocent explanation. An hour later, he found himself in the office of Mia Reynolds, a no-nonsense investigator with sharp eyes and a reputation for uncovering uncomfortable truths. She listened quietly as Mark explained the situation, taking notes without interrupting. "So," Mia said, leaning back in her chair, "you suspect your wife is either having an affair or involved in something criminal. Either way, you're not sure what you're dealing with." Mark hesitated. "I don't want to believe she's cheating. But I saw her meeting those guys, and it didn't look like business as usual." Mia nodded. "I've seen this kind of thing before. Sometimes the truth's worse than you imagine. Sometimes it's not. Either way, you need facts." She handed him a contract. "I'll tail her for a week." Discreetly. "If there's something going on, I'll find out." Mark signed the paperwork and left, a mix of anxiety and hope swirling in his chest. The waiting game had begun. The following days passed in a haze. Mark tried to stay occupied, but his thoughts kept circling back to Emily. She continued her usual routine, seemingly unaware that anything was amiss. At times he wondered if he was being paranoid. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But on Wednesday evening, Mia called with an update. "You were right to be suspicious," she said. "Your wife has been visiting that warehouse frequently. She's meeting with the same group of men you described." Mark's stomach tightened. "Do you know who they are?" "Not yet. But I've run background checks on some of them. They have ties to organized crime, gun smuggling, fraud, money laundering. It's a dangerous crowd." Mark felt his blood run cold. Jesus. Emily's not, she wouldn't get involved with something like that. "Maybe she doesn't have a choice," Mia replied. "It's hard to say. I'll keep digging. In the meantime, stay cautious. If these guys catch wind that you're watching, things could escalate." Mark hung up and stared blankly at the floor. Organized crime. The words echoed in his mind like a death knell. He thought back to every moment Emily had lied to his face. Could she really be tangled up in something so dark? And if so, why hadn't she come to him for help? That night Mark couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, haunted by visions of Emily caught in a web of danger. Finally, around 2 a.m., he got up and paced the house. The eerie quiet pressed down on him. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. He found himself standing in front of Emily's work bag. The temptation gnawed at him. He'd never violated her privacy before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. With a deep breath, he unzipped the bag and began rifling through the contents. Most of it was mundane: reports, office supplies, receipts. But near the bottom, he found something that made his pulse quicken: a burner phone. Mark stared at the device, his hands trembling. Why would Emily need a second phone? He hesitated for a moment before powering it on. The screen lit up with a string of missed calls and encrypted text messages. He couldn't read the messages without a password, but the phone's existence alone was damning. He heard a noise behind him and froze. Emily's voice, groggy with sleep, echoed from the stairs. "Mark? What are you doing?" He quickly slipped the phone back into the bag and turned around. "I couldn't sleep," he lied, his voice tight. "Just pacing." Emily squinted at him, clearly suspicious. "At 2 in the morning?" "Yeah. Just restless, I guess." She didn't look convinced but didn't press the issue. "Come back to bed," she murmured, rubbing her eyes. Mark nodded, following her upstairs, but his mind raced. The burner phone was the final piece of confirmation he needed. Emily was hiding something serious, and he was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The next day, Mark reached out to Mia again and told her about the phone. "Can you figure out how to access encrypted messages?" "Maybe," Mia said. "But if you're caught, it'll blow everything. Are you sure you want to risk it?" Mark hesitated, then sighed. "No. Not yet. Let's see what else we can find first." Later that evening, Mark watched Emily as they sat on the couch. She was scrolling through her phone, her face calm and detached. It infuriated him. How could she sit there so casually, pretending everything was fine? "You've been quiet lately," Emily remarked, not looking up. "Just tired," Mark replied. She smiled faintly. "You work too hard." Mark's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but he knew it wasn't time. Not yet. He needed more. The shadows between them had grown darker, and soon, there would be no turning back. Mark's paranoia deepened with each passing day. He could hardly focus on anything but the weight of Emily's secrets. At work, he sat in meetings, barely registering what his colleagues said. His boss asked him twice if he was okay. "Yeah, just a rough week," Mark had mumbled, forcing a strained smile. At night, he lay awake beside Emily, his mind racing. Her calm demeanor infuriated him. How could she keep lying so smoothly, pretending they were the same couple they'd always been? He couldn't stand it. The next time she left the house, he planned to follow her himself. He had to see more with his own eyes. That opportunity came sooner than expected. On Friday evening, Emily announced that she'd be working late again. "I've got a client dinner," she explained while casually applying lipstick in the bathroom mirror. Mark watched her from the doorway. "Another one?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. She smiled. "Yeah, it's that season, I guess. Lots of networking events." He nodded, forcing himself to play along. "Don't overdo it. Don't worry about me," she said lightly, turning to kiss him on the cheek. As soon as she left, Mark grabbed his jacket and car keys. He followed her at a distance, careful not to get too close. Her car weaved through the city streets until they reached the industrial district again. Mark parked down the block and watched as she approached the same warehouse from before. This time, he didn't stay in the car. He waited until she disappeared inside, then made his way toward the building, heart pounding. The door creaked slightly as he slipped through the entrance. He hugged the shadows, moving as quietly as possible. Inside, the scene was similar to last time. Emily stood near a group of men, all of them gathered around a table covered with documents and electronics. One of the men, a tall figure with a scar running across his cheek, seemed to be giving instructions. Emily nodded as he spoke, jotting down notes. Mark strained to hear their conversation. He caught a few phrases. Shipment arrival, federal surveillance, and secure the back entrance. His mind reeled. This wasn't an affair. This was something far more serious. Suddenly, Scarface's gaze snapped toward Mark's hiding spot. Wait. Did you hear that? Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He ducked lower, his pulse hammering in his ears. Another man pulled a flashlight from his pocket and began sweeping the area. Someone's here, the man growled. Check the perimeter. Mark didn't wait for them to get closer. He slipped out the door and sprinted to his car, adrenaline flooding his system. As he sped away, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following him. But the street remained dark and empty. When he finally reached home, he sat in his driveway, shaking. This wasn't just organized crime. There was another layer to this. The mention of federal surveillance suggested law enforcement was involved, possibly undercover. Was Emily working for them? Was she part of a sting operation? The thought seemed absurd, but it explained her secrecy. If she were part of a covert operation, she wouldn't be able to tell him anything. But then why meet in such dangerous places? Why take such risks? And why lie so brazenly to him about her late nights? His head spun with questions as he finally stepped inside. He poured himself a whiskey and downed it in one gulp. The burning sensation in his throat did little to calm him. Later that night, Emily returned, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Mark was in the living room, pretending to watch TV. She smiled when she saw him. You're still up? Couldn't sleep, he replied, keeping his tone light. She set her purse on the counter and walked over to sit beside him. Rough day at work? Yeah. Same old. He forced a chuckle. How was your client dinner? Pretty standard, she said, leaning back against the couch. Lots of small talk, a few boring speeches. Mark nodded, biting back the urge to confront her. Instead, he tried to read her body language. She didn't seem nervous or defensive, just tired. But there was a tension in her shoulders, something she was trying hard to hide. You've been working a lot lately, he said after a pause. Emily sighed. I know. It's been non-stop. Hopefully, things will slow down soon. He nodded again, pretending to accept her answer. Inside, however, he was screaming. He wanted to ask her about the warehouse, about the men with criminal ties, about the phrases he'd overheard. But he couldn't tip his hand yet. Not without more proof. Emily yawned and stood. I'm gonna head to bed. You coming? In a bit, Mark replied. Okay. Don't stay up too late. She gave him a soft smile before disappearing down the hall. Mark sat in silence for a long time, the flickering TV casting shadows across the room. He felt trapped, like a man drowning in a sea of half-truths and unanswered questions. Whatever was happening, it was reaching a breaking point. The next morning, Mia called again. We need to meet, she said without preamble. I found something you're going to want to see. Mark's pulse quickened. What is it? I can't explain over the phone. Just come by my office. And bring any other evidence you've got. Mark hung up, a pit forming in his stomach. He didn't know what Mia had discovered, but he sensed that the answers would change everything. Mark arrived at Mia's office within the hour, his nerves fraying like loose wires. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he parked outside the building. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing: after today, there would be no going back. Mia met him at the door, her expression grim. Come in, she said, motioning him inside. Her office smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer toner. Files were stacked haphazardly on her desk, and one particular folder sat open, thick with photographs and typed reports. "I've confirmed that some of the men your wife is meeting have direct ties to criminal networks," Mia began, sitting down across from him. "However, I found something else. Something you're not going to like." Mark's mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" Mia handed him a series of photographs. Mark stared at the images, his stomach twisting into knots. They showed Emily sitting in a coffee shop across from a man in a suit, someone who radiated authority. Mia tapped the image. "That's Agent Paul Whitman, FBI. He's part of an ongoing investigation into arms trafficking. Your wife seems to be connected to him in some capacity." "FBI?" Mark echoed, his voice barely a whisper. "You think Emily's working with them?" "It's possible," Mia said carefully. "But the FBI doesn't just recruit civilians for something like this. If she's involved, it might be deeper than that." Mark shook his head in disbelief. Emily, his Emily, caught up in an FBI sting operation? It sounded insane, but it also made a strange kind of sense. It explained the secrecy, the burner phone, and the high-level meetings. Mia handed him more papers. "Here's what else I found. Emily's name appears in a few intelligence reports, mostly redacted. Someone's been protecting her identity. If she's undercover, she's either cooperating with the feds or being used as an asset." Mark leaned back, running a hand over his face. "So what the hell am I supposed to do now?" "Lay low," Mia advised. "If this operation is as big as it seems, poking around could put you both in danger. I'll keep monitoring things, but you need to be careful. The people your wife is dealing with aren't the kind you want to cross." Mark nodded slowly, though his mind screamed with questions. He needed answers from Emily, but how could he confront her without jeopardizing her, and himself? The drive home was a blur. Mark's thoughts spiraled, replaying every suspicious moment from the past few weeks in a new light. Could Emily have been hiding something like this all along? And if so, why hadn't she trusted him enough to tell him the truth? When he reached the house, Emily was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening. "Hey! You were out early." "Had a few errands to run," Mark said, forcing a casual tone. He moved to the fridge, pretending to rummage for a drink. His mind raced as he watched her from the corner of his eye. She seemed relaxed, but now he couldn't tell if it was genuine or an act. "Everything okay?" she asked, closing her laptop. "Yeah. Just tired, I guess." He cracked open a bottle of water and took a long sip, hoping to calm his nerves. Emily stood and walked over to him, resting a hand on his arm. "You've been off lately. Is something bothering you?" Mark froze. The irony of the question hit him like a punch to the gut. She was the one keeping secrets, yet here she was, pretending to care. "I'm fine," he lied. "Work's just been stressful." She frowned but didn't press further. "Well, let me know if you want to talk." Mark nodded, but inside, he was seething. He had reached his breaking point. If she wasn't going to come clean, he would force the truth out of her. That evening, Mark sat in the living room, waiting. Emily busied herself upstairs, tidying the bedroom. He stared at the burner phone he'd taken from her bag earlier. His thumb hovered over the power button, debating whether to dig deeper. Before he could make a decision, footsteps echoed down the stairs. Emily entered the room, a faint smile on her face. "Movie night?" she suggested, holding up a DVD case. Mark set the phone down on the coffee table, his jaw tightening. "Emily, we need to talk." She hesitated. "Okay, about what?" "About what you've been doing. About where you've been going at night. The warehouse. The men you're meeting." Her eyes widened in shock. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have a quick reply. "Mark, I can explain." "Then explain," he demanded, his voice rising. "Don't lie to me this time. I saw you. I heard you. I know you're hiding something." Emily's face paled. She glanced at the front window, as though checking to see if anyone was watching. Then she sighed and sat down beside him. It's not what you think, she said quietly. Then tell me, Mark insisted. Because right now, it looks like you're in serious trouble. For a long moment, Emily was silent. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. Mark, you need to trust me. I can't tell you everything, but I swear I'm not cheating on you. I'm involved in something that's bigger than both of us. And if you dig too deep, you'll put yourself in danger. Mark stared at her, his mind racing. Emily, are you working for the FBI? Her eyes widened slightly before she quickly masked her reaction. Please, Mark. Just drop this. He shook his head. I can't. Not until I know you're safe. Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. I am safe. But you have to let me handle this. Trust me. Mark wanted to believe her. But the weight of her secrets loomed between them like a shadow. Mark barely slept that night. Emily's cryptic warnings echoed in his mind, twisting his thoughts into tighter knots. You'll put yourself in danger. Trust me. He hated how powerless those words made him feel. He was supposed to be her husband, the one person she should trust above all else. Yet here he was, locked out of her world and left in the dark. By the time dawn broke, Mark had made a decision. If Emily wouldn't give him the full truth, he would find it himself. He couldn't ignore the fear in her eyes when he confronted her. Whatever she was caught up in, it was serious. He needed to protect her, even if that meant going behind her back to learn the truth. Mia met him later that morning in a discreet cafe across town. The tension between them was palpable as Mark laid out what had happened the night before. She admitted she's involved in something big, he said in a low voice. She didn't deny the FBI connection. But she wouldn't tell me anything else. Mia's eyes narrowed. That's more than we had before. If she's under federal protection, it's possible they've warned her not to discuss the case with anyone, not even family. Mark nodded grimly. So what do we do now? I keep investigating, Mia said firmly. I've got a few leads I'm following. Meanwhile, you need to stay alert. If those men get suspicious of you, things could escalate fast. Mark clenched his jaw. The idea of Emily being in danger made his skin crawl. Just tell me if you find anything new. I don't want her blindsided. Mia leaned forward, her tone softening. You care about her. I get that. But you need to take care of yourself too. These kinds of cases don't always end well. Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. I just want my wife back, he whispered. The next few days were tense and uneventful. Emily continued her routine, acting as if nothing had changed. She smiled more, tried to engage Mark in conversations about mundane things, but he knew it was all a mask. He played along, biding his time while Mia worked in the background. On Thursday evening, Emily announced she had another late meeting. I'll probably be home around midnight, she said, grabbing her keys. Don't wait up. Mark nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Stay safe. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. I will, she murmured before slipping out the door. The second she was gone, Mark grabbed his phone and texted Mia. She just left. Heading to the warehouse again, I assume. You ready? Mia replied almost instantly. Already nearby. I'll keep you posted. Stay put. Mark paced the living room, anxiety building with each passing minute. He hated sitting on the sidelines, but Mia had insisted it was too dangerous for him to follow Emily again. All he could do now was wait, and hope that Mia uncovered something substantial. Hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. Mark tried distracting himself with TV, but every noise outside made him tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Finally, just after 11 p.m., his phone buzzed. It was a call from Mia. He answered immediately. What's going on? You were right. She's at the warehouse, Mia said, her voice tense. But something's off. The guys she's meeting are on edge. I saw one of them pacing outside like he's expecting trouble. Mark's pulse quickened. Do you think they're onto her? I don't know. Mia admitted. But I don't like it. I'm going to hang back and see what happens. I'll call if I need backup. Be careful, Mark warned. You too. The line went dead, leaving Mark with a gnawing sense of dread. He couldn't shake the image of Emily surrounded by dangerous men, her life hanging in the balance. He needed to be ready in case things spiraled out of control. It wasn't until almost 1 a.m. that the front door finally creaked open. Mark jumped to his feet as Emily walked in, looking exhausted. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a faint tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. You're still up? She asked, surprised. Couldn't sleep, Mark replied, trying to sound casual. Everything okay? Emily hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Just a long night. Mark studied her face, searching for cracks in her facade. You sure? You look stressed. She forced a smile. It's nothing I can't handle. Mark took a step closer. Emily, you don't have to do this alone. Whatever's going on, we can figure it out together. Her eyes softened for a moment, but then she looked away. I can't, Mark. Not yet. I need you to trust me. I'm trying, he said quietly. But it's hard when you keep shutting me out. Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. I know. I hate it too. But if you really want to help, the best thing you can do is stay out of it. Mark's fists clenched at his sides. He hated feeling helpless, but he could see the fear lurking behind her eyes. Something big was coming, and whether he liked it or not, they were both caught in the middle. After Emily went to bed, Mark sat alone in the darkened living room, his thoughts racing. Whatever was happening, the endgame was approaching. And when it did, he would be ready. The next day passed in a blur of unease and tension. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were on borrowed time. He kept thinking of the pacing men outside the warehouse and the way Emily's eyes seemed haunted. The web of lies was tightening, and Mark feared what would happen when it finally snapped. Mia called him that afternoon. I have an update, she said without preamble. It's not good. Mark's stomach nodded. What's going on? Word on the street is that some of the people Emily's been dealing with are becoming paranoid. There's talk about a mole, someone feeding information to law enforcement. They don't know who it is yet, but if they find out Emily's involved, things could get ugly fast. Mark swore under his breath. Does she know? I doubt it. They're keeping her close, probably to keep an eye on her. This isn't just about her being undercover anymore. It's a ticking time bomb. Mark's jaw clenched. He needed to protect Emily, but how? Confronting her again might push her to shut him out completely. At the same time, if he stayed silent, she could be walking straight into a trap. Thanks for the heads up, he said. Keep me posted. Mia hesitated. Mark, you might need to consider the possibility that Emily's in deeper than you thought. If she's compromised, the feds might cut her loose. Mark's throat tightened. They wouldn't do that. I've seen it happen, Mia replied grimly. Just be prepared. That evening, Mark paced the house, his anxiety mounting. Emily returned around 7 p.m., looking more composed than the night before. She kissed him lightly on the cheek and asked about his day, but Mark could barely respond. We should have a date night soon, she suggested while rummaging through the fridge. Just us. It's been a while. Mark blinked in surprise. Date night? Yeah. Maybe dinner at that Italian place you like? She smiled at him, but there was a nervous edge to it. He realized she was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, as if that could erase the growing chasm between them. Sure, he said after a pause. That sounds nice. They ate dinner in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Mark kept glancing at her, wondering how she could act so calm when everything around them was unraveling. Did she really think she could keep up the charade forever? Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Mark couldn't hold it in anymore. Emily, he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. She looked up from her phone. Yeah? We need to talk. For real this time. Her smile faltered. Mark, I already told you. No, he interrupted, his voice firm. No more half-truths. I know you're in danger. I know those men think someone's feeding information to the authorities. If they find out it's you. Emily's eyes widened in shock. How do you know about that? I have my ways, he said cryptically, not wanting to drag Mia into it. You don't have to keep me in the dark anymore. I want to help you. Emily stared at him for a long moment, her expression a mixture of fear and conflict. Finally, she exhaled shakily and sat beside him. I didn't want you involved, she whispered. I thought I could protect you by keeping you out of it. Mark reached for her hand. You don't have to protect me. We're in this together. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Okay. I'll tell you what I can. But you have to promise not to do anything reckless. Deal, Mark said, though he knew deep down that promise might be hard to keep. Emily leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm working with the FBI. It started months ago. They approached me after some financial discrepancies at my job led to a larger investigation. I had no choice but to cooperate. They're using me to gather intel on a smuggling ring tied to my company's clients. Mark's mind raced as he absorbed her words. And the men at the warehouse? They think I'm one of them, she explained. But tensions are rising. Someone's been leaking information, and they're starting to suspect everyone, including me. Jesus, Emily. Mark ran a hand through his hair. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I couldn't, she said, her voice cracking. The FBI warned me not to. They said it would put you at risk. I thought I could handle it on my own, but now, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Mark squeezed her hand tightly. You don't have to handle it alone anymore. We'll figure something out. Emily gave him a small, tired smile. Thank you. The following day, Mark and Emily worked quietly to devise a plan. She reached out to her FBI contact, Agent Whitman, and arranged a meeting to discuss her situation. Mark insisted on coming with her, despite her protests. That evening, as they drove to the meeting spot, a secluded parking lot on the outskirts of town, Mark's nerves were on edge. He kept glancing in the mirrors, watching for any sign of trouble. Emily sat beside him, visibly tense. We're almost there, she murmured. Mark nodded, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, every passing car felt like a potential threat. We'll get through this, he said, more to reassure himself than her. Emily didn't respond, but she reached over and squeezed his hand. The gesture gave him a flicker of hope. They were finally facing the truth, together. But deep down, Mark knew the danger wasn't over yet. The storm was still coming. Mark and Emily pulled into the dimly lit parking lot just after 9 p.m. The area was desolate, surrounded by tall industrial buildings with broken windows. Agent Paul Whitman stood near a black SUV, his face partially obscured by the glow of a nearby street lamp. Mark felt a chill crawl down his spine as he parked the car. You trust him? Mark asked quietly as they stepped out. Emily hesitated, then nodded. He's the one who got me into this. He's been straight with me so far. Mark wasn't convinced. There was something about Whitman's presence that unsettled him, too calm, too composed. But he followed Emily as she approached the agent. Emily, Whitman greeted her with a curt nod. You weren't followed? No, she replied. This is my husband, Mark. He knows everything now. Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly as he sized Mark up. That's not ideal. Civilians shouldn't be involved. With all due respect, Mark said, stepping forward, I'm already involved. You put my wife in danger, so now I'm here to make sure she's protected. Whitman sighed. Fair enough. But you need to understand that things are about to escalate. We have intelligence that the smuggling ring is planning a major deal tomorrow night. We're moving in, and Emily's cover will be blown. We need her to cooperate one last time to make sure the operation succeeds. Emily stiffened. One last time? You said I was almost out. I know, Whitman said. But this is bigger than we anticipated. If you help us lock it down tomorrow, we can guarantee your safety afterward. Mark felt his anger boiling. Guarantee her safety? You've barely kept her safe so far. How do we know you're not just using her as bait? Whitman held his hands up defensively. I get your concern, but trust me, we don't want anything to happen to her. She's been a key asset. Emily glanced nervously at Mark, then back at Whitman. What exactly do you need me to do? Attend the meeting tomorrow night. Keep the players talking long enough for us to surround the building. Once we have them, you're out. We'll extract you immediately. Mark shook his head. No way. It's too dangerous. It's the only option, Whitman said flatly. Emily placed a hand on Mark's arm. Mark, I have to do this. If I back out now, they'll come after both of us. Mark's jaw clenched. He hated every second of this, but Emily was right. They were trapped. Fine, he muttered. But I'm coming with you. Whitman frowned. Absolutely not. You'll just get in the way. I'm not asking. Mark snapped. You're not leaving her in that building alone. The tension between the two men was palpable. Finally, Whitman relented with a frustrated sigh. All right. But you follow my instructions to the letter. No improvising. The next evening, Mark and Emily arrived at the warehouse under the guise of business as usual. The atmosphere inside was tense, the men suspicious and on edge. Scarface, the leader of the smuggling ring, eyed Emily warily as she approached the negotiation table. You've been quiet lately, he remarked, his voice low and gravelly. Anything we should know about? Emily smiled, keeping her tone light. Just keeping my head down. Things have been getting complicated. Scarface nodded slowly but didn't seem convinced. He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on Mark, who stood near the entrance pretending to be disinterested. Who's the guy? Scarface asked. A consultant, Emily replied smoothly. Helps me with logistics. Scarface grunted in response and motioned for her to sit. The conversation turned to business, but Mark could feel the tension escalating with every passing minute. His eyes darted to the shadows where he knew the FBI agents were positioned, waiting for the signal to move in. Suddenly, one of Scarface's men pulled out a phone and began whispering urgently to him. Scarface's expression darkened, and he stood abruptly. Something's not right, he growled. We're being watched. Emily's face paled. What are you talking about? We have a rat. Scarface hissed, pulling a gun from his waistband. His eyes locked on Emily. Is it you? Mark's heart pounded as he instinctively stepped forward. Hey, calm down. Nobody's. Shut up. Scarface barked, aiming the gun at Mark. Stay right there. Chaos erupted. The doors burst open as FBI agents stormed the warehouse, shouting commands. Gunfire echoed through the cavernous space as the smugglers tried to fight back. Mark grabbed Emily and pulled her behind a stack of crates, shielding her from the gunfire. Stay down, he shouted over the noise. Emily clutched his arm, trembling. This wasn't supposed to happen. The firefight seemed to last forever, but eventually the gunshots ceased. The smugglers were subdued, handcuffed and dragged out by the agents. Whitman appeared moments later, his face grim. Are you both all right? He asked. Barely, Mark muttered, helping Emily to her feet. Whitman nodded. It's over. You're safe now. But as Mark looked around the wreckage, he didn't feel safe. The memory of Scarface's gun pointed at Emily burned in his mind. He had come too close to losing her. Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. It's really over? Yeah, Mark said softly, pulling her into a tight embrace. It's over. But deep down, he knew the scars of this ordeal would linger. Trust would take time to rebuild. For now, though, they had survived. Together.